What's up, everybody, and welcome back to our series on American industrialization. This episode is going to be called The Gilded Age, which is another name for this time period after Reconstruction and up until World War I. But what does it mean to call this age gilded? So gilding is actually a method of decoration. You might see it on something like a picture frame or a mirror, and gilding is when you coat that picture frame in a really thin foil of gold. That way, when you first see the picture frame, it looks very impressive. It looks like it's this amazing solid gold piece, but just below the surface, there's actually a much cheaper and lower quality material. So you're using something flashy and expensive to cover up an ugliness underneath. People will use this term to describe this period of industrialization because when we study this period, often what we focus on is the lives of the captains of industry, these owners of gigantic corporations that made extreme amounts of wealth and built gigantic palaces and lived in luxury. And as historians, it's important to understand this, but it's also important that we shift our perspectives and understand that that experience was actually an extremely rare one. For a vast majority of Americans, industrialization was not glamorous. And in fact, for most workers, even though the American economy was growing and some were becoming incredibly wealthy, many people's lives were actually getting worse. And that's what we're going to focus on in this episode. We're going to zoom in on the lives of the average American worker. Over the past 3 episodes, we've covered a number of big picture economic concepts that were instrumental in shaping and creating the American economy in this time period. But it's important that we remember that most people were not starting new businesses and practicing vertical and horizontal integration. In fact, in this time period, most people couldn't even afford to purchase stock. A vast majority of Americans were the ones working in these businesses, waking up, going to work, making what they could to get by for themselves and their family. And as the American economy grew and technology became more advanced, it ironically became more difficult for these average Americans to just get by. But just who were these industrial workers? Let's break them down into 3 categories, and know that not all people fit into these 3 categories, and in fact, some people might fit into more than one of these 3 categories. But just to generalize, let's say that a vast majority of these industrial workers were displaced farmers, African Americans resettling from the South, and recent immigrants to the United States. First, let's talk displaced farmers. Although in the present day, probably not many of us know farmers in our day-to-day life, for a vast majority of human history, agriculture was the most common profession. I mean, everybody's got to eat, right? So in a given society, you need enough farmers to feed the rest of your population. In 1820 in the United States, 72% of all workers worked in agriculture, meaning that in order to feed 100% of people, 72% of those people needed to be working and producing food. By 1920, just 100 years later, that percentage dropped to 30%. Meaning that only 30% of people needed to work to provide the nutrition for the rest of the society. This is due to industrialization. Even though when we hear that word, we might picture things like factories, this also meant advanced farming techniques, the development of things like tractors, as well as scientific advancements like the creation of chemical fertilizers. These innovations meant that individual farmers could produce more food, as long as they had the money to invest in these new techniques. The flip side of these advancements were that over the course of the 1800s, half of all farmers had to leave their farms and look for new jobs, and a vast majority of them looked for new industrial jobs in the cities. The second group that made up American industrial workers were African Americans who were relocating from the rural South. At the time of emancipation in 1865, a vast majority of African Americans lived in the rural South. When Reconstruction ended, with the Northern Army being withdrawn from the South in 1877, the Southern states reinstituted a regime of racist violence and oppression, passing Jim Crow laws that discriminated against African Americans, a sharecropping system that essentially maintained the economic conditions of slavery, as well as periodic outbursts of racist mob violence by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. It's not surprising that many African Americans that had the opportunity to chose to leave the South and instead look for work in northern and midwestern cities. The last group that we're going to look at that made up American industrial workers were immigrants. This period of industrialization coincided with the largest immigration boom in American history. Most notably, this wave of immigrants was made up of millions of Italians, Eastern European Jews, Poles, Greeks, and other Eastern Europeans who entered the U.S. in the late 18 and early 1900s, mostly settling in the industrial cities of the East Coast and the Midwest. On the West Coast, millions of Chinese immigrants came in and settled in California, and all these groups together, by and large, worked industrial jobs. And we'll talk about the economic implications of this in a minute, But it's also important to remember that culturally this was hugely influential to the development of the United States. This brought hundreds of new cultures into America, and industrial cities often became the types of multicultural places that they remain today. This multiculturalism led to new forms of music and cuisine and art and entertainment and more, blending together into a new culture that we could really call distinctly American. Though it's not exactly correct to describe this as a free, open-minded cultural exchange all throughout. As these groups converged on these big industrial cities, mostly on the East Coast and Midwest, they tended to settle in neighborhoods predominantly occupied by people of their own culture, ethnicity, or religion. Many cities in this time period become defined by these ethnic neighborhoods where certain sections of the city are associated with certain groups of people, and these divisions often persist to this day. In the struggle to build a new life for themselves, often in extreme poverty, these groups tended to remain divided, separated by ideas of racism and xenophobia, xenophobia meaning the dislike of immigrants. But despite these divisions, these groups often had more in common than they realized. A vast majority of these people were coming from agricultural work, and were often displaced by the industrialization in agriculture, whether that was something that was happening in Ohio or in Russia. Many of the people knew that they had to work industrial jobs, but really had aspirations to save their money and buy agricultural land. Most of these people were in a new place and were cut off from traditional ways of life. Many of them had to leave their ancestral lands and historic occupations to work a new job in a factory. And many were just trying to escape persecution or discrimination, whether that was African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South or Eastern European Jews trying to escape the anti-Semitic pogroms that were sweeping Eastern Europe at this time. Unfortunately, members of these groups often had their own hang-ups and prejudices, frequently seeing other groups as just competition for work. And we'll discuss the economic consequences of this perspective next time. As cities grew and industrialized, the day-to-day lived experience of Americans also began to change. We see the rise of mass culture in the form of newspapers with wide readership. We also see the rise of what we might call mass entertainment, things like theaters and sports clubs and professional sports teams and even things like amusement parks and later on movie theaters. All these things represented activities that Americans could enjoy on their leisure time. Unfortunately, big, densely crowded cities and the poverty associated with industrial work also led to many big city problems. Industrial workers would often have to live in crowded apartment buildings known as tenements where multiple families might live in a one-room apartment. These close conditions would lead to the quick spread of disease and sickness. Not to mention the psychological effects of living in extreme poverty and being dislocated from where you historically lived. Many people in these conditions turned to drugs and alcohol. All these factors together, combined with the dangerous working conditions in the industrial era, led to a lowered life expectancy, which in turn led to other problems such as high rates of orphanage. And remember that in this era of laissez-faire, the government didn't see it as its problem to deal with orphan children, and often communities were left to rely on the charity of individuals, or in some cases community organizations such as churches to try to solve these community problems. And interestingly enough, one of the types of organizations that would step up to fill the needs vacated by government in these types of communities was actually organized crime. In poor industrial neighborhoods, petty crime was fairly common, but gangs of organized crime or mafias would also be pretty commonplace in these types of neighborhoods. These gangs would engage in the expected type of illegal behavior, trafficking in stolen goods, prostitution, gambling, drugs, etc., but they would often do things like give out loans, given out outrageous interest rates, to members of the community because oftentimes banks wouldn't do business with immigrants. Sometimes organized crime would even team up with local political parties, delivering the votes of their community in exchange for kickbacks and cash or the promise not to prosecute them for their illegal activity. And hopefully by this point, you're getting a sense of the extreme contrasts that existed in the Gilded Age. On one hand, we see the American capitalist class become the richest class in human history, while most of the people working for them are living in extreme poverty. This extreme contrast, this disparity between rich and poor came to define the era, and many people sought to explain why society was taking this shape. And interestingly enough, the explanation that people chose to believe usually told us more about themselves than it did about society in general. Let's take a look at one of those explanations as our primary source today. We're going to read an excerpt from an essay by William Graham Sumner. Sumner was a sociologist at Yale University, and his ideas came to exemplify the concept of social Darwinism. That name, social Darwinism, is in reference to English scientist Charles Darwin, who came up with the ideas of evolution and natural selection. The concept of natural selection is that In nature, organisms are in struggle for survival, and in this struggle, only the species most suited for survival actually make it. Now, the phenomenon that Darwin was describing is one that takes place over thousands of generations as species shift and change and adapt to changing circumstances. Guys like Sumner took these ideas and attempted to apply them to human society, often with disastrous results. Let's take a look at Sumner's essay. He writes, "What civil liberty does is turn the competition of man with man from violence and brute force into an industrial competition, under which men vie with one another for the acquisition of material goods by industry, energy, skill, frugality, prudence, temperance, and other industrial virtues. We can take the rewards from those who have done better and give them to those who have done worse. We shall thus lessen inequalities, but we shall favor survival of the unfittest, and we shall accomplish this by destroying liberty." And there's a lot of issues with what Sumner's talking about here, but first let's zoom into this concept of civil liberty. What he's talking about here, civil liberty, he's referring to an American society with laissez-faire capitalism in which people are set to compete against each other in the free market. And what Sumner is assuming here is that all people in our society are competing on equal ground. And we know that that's not true. This completely disregards the fact that people are coming from different circumstances with different advantages and disadvantages. And yet this concept kind of speaks to us on some deep level, right? I mean, it's basically the American dream, the idea that if you come here and you work hard enough and you have your great idea, then you can build your own success. And certainly some people were able to accomplish that. But to assume that a person's success proves that they are smarter and better because they're wealthy doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, you don't have to be especially smart or talented to, say, inherit $1 million from your parents. Yet naturally, these ideas were more popular among the upper classes because they essentially assured them that they were the best and that they deserved their fortunes, whether they earned them or not. But the really dangerous part of this concept is actually the flip side, when you look at people who are not successful and assume it must be because they're inferior. Social Darwinists would look at neighborhoods of recent immigrants struggling to get by on poverty wages and assume that they must be poor because they were less intelligent or lazy or otherwise inferior. Not because literally the only jobs that would hire recent immigrants were industrial jobs that paid next to nothing. Likewise, social Darwinists would look at black sharecroppers in the South and the extreme poverty that they lived in, and use that as proof of white supremacy rather than examining the racist laws or racist violence that literally forced these conditions upon them. This concept of social Darwinism would in time be extended into overtly white supremacist ideas and would later even be used as justification for eugenics, the practice of denying people who were deemed inferior the right to even have children. Now, these social Darwinist beliefs were not universally held, not even by all members of the upper classes. In fact, some of the wealthiest Americans embraced ideas of philanthropy in an attempt to use their wealth to improve the well-being of the public. Most famously, Andrew Carnegie, who himself was an immigrant who later became the head of the biggest steel company in the world, professed what he called the gospel of wealth, believing that his extreme riches came with an obligation to improve society around him. Carnegie donated millions, building public libraries and concert halls and scholarships and universities, intending to bring learning and culture to all people regardless of their circumstances or social class. Though the more cynical among us might notice that all of these scholarships, libraries, and concert halls had his name on it, which made for very good public relations. And Carnegie's philanthropy didn't stop him from driving down the wages of his workers and firing employees who tried to form unions in his factories. What's a union, you ask? We'll cover that next time. So to recap, in this video we defined the Gilded Age and talked about how the industrialization of agriculture pushed many people into the cities to look for industrial jobs. We talked about how industrial laborers in America were made up of displaced farmers, African Americans, and recent immigrants. And then we talked about how the confluence of these three groups in industrial cities changed American culture and American life. We read a primary source document about social Darwinism and discussed philanthropy as a counterpoint to these ideas. Next time we'll jump back into the economics and talk about why industrial labor sucked so bad and what people did to try to improve it. I'll see you then.